Hello to all of our Monterey Trialogue fellows. It's very lovely to be welcoming you to the inaugural keynote, and it's a little bit surreal, if you forgive me, sort of mildly mawkish moment, because obviously a year ago this was pretty much just a few keywords that I jotted down. Maybe I hadn't even jotted them down, maybe they were still in my head, and now it's actually a real thing. But of course, it's been quite a busy year, to put it euphemistically. And the purpose of the trialogue is to focus on areas and ways to cooperate on those spaces where it still makes sense to discuss, to have, well, not dialogue, but trialogue, and on trying to understand the other's point of view. Whatever you do with that understanding is up to you, but we think that understanding is in itself valuable. And that's why, of course, this doesn't really deal much. We won't really, though it will inevitably come up, we won't really be discussing the war in Ukraine, because crises such as these are obviously those moments when I think emotionally a lot of people on all sides can feel like cutting off contacts or, making some kind of grand statement. But actually, I'd say it's now is the time when those informal people-to-people networks, those people that you can pick up the phone to or text just to understand how serious is this or how to interpret that. I think that's when they're needed the most, between the West, between China, Russia, between all three kind of regions or countries. And that's why I'm very, very happy to be launching this, but also why I'm very, very happy that to start us off with it all, we have a man who's diverse in both his area expertise, disciplinary expertise and life experience. And he has so much to teach us all, interested in diplomacy, international relations, China, Russia, the US, the history of their interactions, just quite a lot. Sergey Radchenko is the Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. As I'm sure you all know, he's written extensively on the Cold War, nuclear history, and on Russian and Chinese foreign and security policies. He served as a Global Fellow and a Public Policy Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Centre and at the Zi Jiang Distinguished Professor, and as the Zi Jiang, Distinguished Professor at East China Normal University in Shanghai. Professor Radchenko's books include Two Suns in the Heavens, The Sino-Soviet Struggle for Supremacy, and Unwanted Visionaries, The Soviet Failure in Asia. And there are more books and more books still to come. Professor Radchenko is a native of Sakhalin Island in Russia, and he was educated in the US, Hong Kong, and the UK, where he received his PhD in 2005 from LSE. Before he joined Johns Hopkins, he worked and lived in Mongolia, China, and most exotically Wales, which is where he joins us from today. So at the end, we'll open up, of course, as well to you, the fellows, for after the keynote, we'll open up to you for the Q&A, which won't be recorded. But for now, Sergey, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jade, for this very generous introduction. Which also covers my biography pretty extensively. There's very little for me to add to this. Obviously, my interest in the subjects that we're discussing today, i.e. China, Russia, and the United States and their relationship, is partly a product of my own experience, having been born on the border between Russia and China, or the Soviet Union and China at that time, when China and the Soviet Union were in a state of acute confrontation. I obviously grew up in relative isolation on the island of Sakhalin in the Soviet and then Russian Far East, but then left Russia at a fairly early age of 15, and since then studied, traveled, worked in various places across continents and time zones before I found my current place of employment, which is usefully based between spread out between Italy and Washington, D.C., Italy, and Nanjing. But of course, with the pandemic, Nanjing has kind of fallen off the map. So I've focused much more on the transatlantic relationship more than anything else. Right. So that's as far as my own biography is concerned. What I wanted to talk about today is tentatively titled China, Russia, and the United States, the Return of Triangular Politics, with a question mark. And I wanted to talk about this relationship, this triangular relationship, through a historical lens, because first and foremost, of course, I'm a historian. So in the next 30 to 40 minutes, I will talk about the history of the relationship, but also spend a little time on discussing the present, perhaps the future of this triangular relationship, especially, of course, focusing on China and Russia, as those are my key areas of expertise. But the things that I will say about them, of course, also have some kind of significance or meaning for the foreign policy of the United States. And before I start, I just wanted to mention that as far as foreign policy prescriptions are concerned, I did yesterday, in fact, I co-wrote an article with Dmitry Alperovich, which appeared in Foreign Affairs, and that looks at precisely this question, this triangular relationship, and how the United States and Russia and China, it really focuses more on the United States and Russia than China, how they should see their future and how they should really manage their complicated relationship. But to start with history, I will speak about three particular moments in international politics. In the first one I wanted to begin with, I suppose, to talk about, was the birth of the Sino-Soviet alliance between 1949 and 1950, which I will explain why it's so significant and why I think it's important to know about. So let me begin with something that happened on September 21st, 1949. This was the moment when Chairman Mao Zedong made his famous speech at the Political Consultative Conference in Beijing. Of course, the Chinese Civil War was by then was more or less won by the communists, and he was making the speech to effectively establish the People's Republic of China, of course, which duly happened on October 1st. Well, on September 21st, he made his famous speech in which he said, and I quote, "Fellow delegates, we are all convinced that our work will go down in the history of mankind, demonstrating that the Chinese people, comprising 1/4 of humanity, have now stood up. The Chinese have always been a great, courageous, and industrious nation. It is only in modern times that they have fallen behind." And then he continues, "Ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation. We have stood up. Our revolution has won the sympathy and acclaim of the people of all countries. We have friends all over the world." So Mao's biggest friend, he was talking about friends all over the world, but Mao's biggest friend, unquestionably, was the Soviet Union and its leader, Joseph Stalin. But their relationship was fairly complicated. Stalin was known for looking after his interests and his country's interests first and foremost, and Mao would later accuse him on a number of times for betraying the Chinese Revolution or for not paying enough attention to the Chinese Revolution. And there's some truth to this. So when the Chinese Civil War broke out after the end of the Second World War in Asia, in China, Stalin effectively, Stalin did not really want this civil war to happen. He had his own priorities, which were spelled out quite well in the Yalta Agreement of February 1945, which carried with this recognition of Soviet gains in Europe, but also in Asia. And Stalin valued this recognition immensely. He believed in power, of course. He believed in raw power, but he also believed in legitimacy. And legitimacy does not just come from anywhere. It comes from recognition of your gains by a rival power. And in that case, in that context of post-war politics, of course, it was the United States. The fact that FDR was willing to recognize Stalin's gains in Eastern Europe was huge for Stalin. And he was also willing to make some concessions in return. The fact that FDR was willing to recognize Soviet gains in Asia, in China, including, by the way, in terms of territorial gains like the island of Sakhalin, where I grew up, that was important for Stalin as well, because of course, up to 1945, southern Sakhalin was Karafuto, and belonged to Japan. And for that, Stalin was also willing to make concessions. including effectively sacrificing the Chinese communists and establishing actually a fairly reasonable working relationship with the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party of China. And then the Chinese Civil War broke out, unexpectedly for him. He actually wanted a coalition government in China. He actually forced Mao in August 1945 to go to Chongqing, the wartime capital of China, and negotiate with Chiang Kai-shek. And Mao didn't want to do that. He said, how can you do that to me? First of all, he just was afraid that Chiang Kai-shek would order his plane shot down. So he got the US ambassador to actually accompany him. But, beyond that, Mao could never understand how Stalin could betray an ideological ally in order, for what? To have an agreement with Chiang Kai-shek? That didn't make any sense. Anyway, but it made sense for Stalin because he wanted a reasonable relationship with Chiang Kai-shek, ratified, as it were, and blessed by the United States, which recognized Soviet gains in East Asia, including a military naval base in Liaodong Peninsula, and railroad that he got there in Manchuria, et cetera, et cetera. So all kinds of useful things. Of course, independence of Mongolia, that was also important to Stalin. Anyway, so Mao felt that this was a kind of a betrayal of revolution. And then as the Civil War progressed, despite Stalin's wishes, Mao felt that Stalin was not supporting him and was constantly prodding him to negotiate with the Kuomintang. So, yeah, there was something to Mao's complaints about Stalin, that Stalin had betrayed the Chinese Revolution, never believed in Chinese Revolution, and that he never believed in Mao himself because he thought that Mao was a kind of a half Tito, of course, referring to the split that the Soviet Union had with Yugoslavia in 1947. Now, however, by 1949, the Chinese communists were winning the Civil War, with or without Soviet support. They were winning the Civil War, and Stalin increasingly was willing to provide them with support. And Mao Zedong also had to decide, Mao Zedong had to decide whether, how to manage his relation with the Soviet Union, which he did by publishing that famous article about leaning to one side in the global Cold War. So he decided to lean to the Soviet side for presumably ideological reasons. Now, in December 1949, Mao finally went to Moscow, something he had wanted to do for a long time, to meet with Stalin. This was his first and last meeting with a Soviet leader. Well, he spent a few weeks in Moscow anyway, met Stalin on several occasions while he was there. But he was there to negotiate the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Alliance, which Stalin initially refused to do, which greatly annoyed and surprised Mao. But later, somehow Stalin agreed to do this. And so on February 14th, 1950, China and the Soviet Union concluded their eternal and unbreakable Treaty of Alliance, which really reshaped global politics and really scared the United States. I don't know if scared is the right, alarmed is the right word here. Alarmed the United States because just by looking at the map, you could see that so much of Eurasia was turning red, and presumably that undermined American strategic interests and so on and so forth. And of course, that was followed very shortly in June 1950 by the North Korean invasion of South Korea. And not too long after that, the Chinese involvement, obviously, in the Korean War. American foreign policy toughened considerably in the aftermath of this. Paul Nitze, after whom my beloved institution is named, I'm in School of Advanced International Studies, was actually one of the kind of leading advocates of that toughening policy of greater resolve of confronting the Soviet Union and the global communist threats, etc. We know about this because obviously his authorship of NSC 68 and so on. But there was a debate. There was a debate at the same time in the United States about whether the United States, Washington, could have or should have done more to somehow split China and the Soviet Union and not allow this alliance to come together the way it did. And the reasons for the reason for this debate, this debate was much more, debate among historians than anything else. But the reason for this debate among historians was a declassification in the 1970s of the discussions in the State Department and among American missions in China about the Chinese communists. And some very interesting things came through, including the fact that the American ambassador in China, John Layton Stewart, had secret communications with Huang Hua, who was the liaison officer of the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese communists have been inviting John Layton Stewart to come to Beijing, or Beiping it was called at the time, and that didn't go because Dean Acheson was against this. But then there was also an interesting report that was filed, if I'm not mistaken, I may be mistaken on this, don't quote me on this, but I think it was Edmund Clubb, who was consul in Beijing, American consul, and he filed a report about Zhou Enlai, the Chinese communist who would become, prime minister of China, and allegedly Zhou Enlai was saying that there was a difference in the communist leadership, there were different approaches in the communist leadership. A part of the leadership who were just really fixated on this communist idea in solidarity with the Soviet Union, including people like Liu Shaoqi, wanted to have closer relationship with the Soviet Union, whereas a more pragmatic part of leadership wanted to have a closer relationship, or at least equidistant relationship, and embrace the United States somehow and balance the Soviet Union against the United States in a kind of a form of non-alignment. Now, historians later in the 1990s, including people like Chen Jian, including people like Odarny Westad, who's my not only good friend, but also supervisor, my doctoral supervisor, thoroughly debunked the theory that somehow the United States lost China in 1949, or that they could have done something in order to change the minds of the Chinese leadership about rapprochement with the Soviet Union. The reason was that, according to people like Chen Jian, Mao Zedong was simply ideologically fixated on this idea of building communism. And of course, if you build communism, you have to be with the main communist country. You cannot play the United States, the world imperialists against, motherland of socialism. And so you absolutely had to clean the house before inviting guests, as the saying goes, i.e. kick out the Americans and eventually obviously invite the Soviets first and foremost. So for those ideological reasons, there was no lost chance. But I'm just mentioning this debate, and you'll see why I'm bringing this up. This is a debate that historians have kind of had very interesting exchanges about back in the 1990s, which is a long time ago, obviously. Well, okay, so this was the first moment, the moment of the Sino-Soviet alliance, eternal, unbreakable for all ages, but it didn't last. Within 10 years, the Sino-Soviet alliance was already falling apart. It was falling apart very quickly, and indeed, by 1969, things got so bad that China and the Soviet Union actually fought a border war in the area of Damansky or Zhenbaodao on Usuri River in the border between Manchuria and the Soviet Far East. So why? What happened? I mean, what happened to this unbreakable friendship? Different theories have been put forward by historians about the reasons for the Sino-Soviet split. My good friend and colleague from McGill University, Lawrence Luthi, whom some of you may know, also prominent historian of the Sino-Soviet split, argued in favor of the ideological explanation. That is to say, it was like a split in the church, sort of like a split in between split between the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, something like that, or with the church split, or the split during the Reformation. In his view, at least, and other historians have also argued along those similar lines, Mao's version of communism was utterly incompatible with the Soviet version of communism. So therefore, when Mao said that we are ideologically opposed to the Soviet Union, he really meant it. And that was the reason that many other things happened, i.e. the border confrontation was because of that, because of the ideological split, which gradually kind of found its way into state-to-state relations, etc. So ideology is the primary causal factor of the split. In my time, when I had the discussions, very interesting academic discussions with Lawrence, I advanced a different proposition. I was very much against this ideological take on the Sino-Soviet split, and the reason for that was, having looked at the Sino-Soviet split primarily from the Soviet side, what I found was that the Soviet leaders themselves they were quite cynical, actually. They did not really believe that the fundamental reasons for divergence between China and the Soviet Union was ideological, because they thought that actually they were on the same page with regard to key tenets of Marxism-Leninism, whether it's world revolution or whether it's, the possibility of world war, et cetera, et cetera. So they were all on the same page. It was something else, according to people like Khrushchev and Brezhnev in any case. So another explanation for the Sino-Soviet divergence that has been put forward is national interest. And this explanation basically says, well, China and the Soviet Union, i.e. Russia today, they are so different. I mean, they are great powers and they have their very, very different national interests. And because they're great powers, those national interests are automatically somehow incompatible, because that's just, national interest. That's how great powers work, right? They have incompatible national interests. And the problem with this, as you can imagine, is, well, who defines national interest? I mean, national interests, if you take more of a constructivist approach to this, you could say national interests are what you make of them, to misquote a favorite, famous theorist of international relations. So in 1949, 1950, national interests of China and the Soviet Union allowed their unbreakable alliance to come together. And only a few years later, there was a split. How can national interests change so fast? They don't explain change. That is the problem with IR scholarship of realist bent in theory, in general, in that it doesn't really cope with change particularly well. So not so many historians are satisfied with the national interest explanations. If you read any work about Sino-Soviet relations that is fairly contemporary, fairly recent, I think you'll find a lot of skepticism about this. Right. The next thing that has been put forward as a reason, and that is kind of where it becomes very interesting, is the psychological incompatibility or some kind of a personal conflict between Chairman Mao Zedong and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Each saw himself as the great leader of some kind of a great power. And, Mao, frankly, he was willing to be Stalin's underdog, but he wasn't willing to play a second fiddle to Khrushchev, whom he thought was, a bit of a clown, really, without any kind of theoretical sophistication, no revolutionary achievements to his record, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, who was Khrushchev from Mao's perspective? A joke, right? It was an absolute joke. And how can Khrushchev claim that he's the leader of this great socialist camp? So there was this interest. The reason this is interesting, of course, is that we are again today witnessing resurgence of interest in the personality of leaders. For example, when we talk today about Putin and his strategy, his decision-making, so much seems to hinge on a particular person's interpretation of the world, or some kind of fixations, or maybe, fantasies, delusions, and so on. So it's much more, it seems, at least to me, it seems, because of course I'm a historian who studies these personalities, so much it can be attributed to personal psychological makeup of these people, and much less can be attributed to some kind of, broad forces of history, or, to kind of take to slightly ridicule a Marxist take. Right. So this is an interesting possibility that they were, there was psychological incompatibility, and you can see that actually in the record. Khrushchev thought that Mao was full of hot air, and Mao thought that Khrushchev was a joke, etc. Now, here's how I explain the Sino-Soviet divergence in my own work. I argued that the alliance was hierarchical, and therefore it was too inflexible. And the Chinese were the underdogs of the alliance. They were the junior partner. They were not willing to put up with this position for too long. Mao could do that when Stalin was around. When Khrushchev was around, Mao wanted to exert more leadership within the alliance, to define the strategic direction of the alliance. He wanted Khrushchev to defer to his wisdom, to his leadership, and that wasn't happening. Khrushchev was not the kind of personality that would allow this. Khrushchev had a very interesting interpretation of this. In 1963, i.e., already when the Sino-Soviet alliance was in tatters, Fidel Castro visited Moscow. It was in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In June 1963, he was in Moscow and traveled across the USSR and had extensive conversations with Khrushchev. And of course, one of the things that Fidel Castro was really interested about was why China and the Soviet Union were quarreling. What was going on? The records of his conversations with Khrushchev still have not been declassified, although much else has. But Khrushchev later discussed this visit with his colleagues at the Politburo, and he recounted the following conversation with Castro. He said, he asked me, Khrushchev recalled, what are our differences with China? I said, that's exactly what I'm asking. What are the differences? And then Khrushchev said, it's a question of nationalism, a question of egotism. This is the main thing. They want to play the first fiddle. And then he said, but this is not decided by vote. Listen to this. This is determined by one's status and by the other's recognition. Even among friends, 5-10 people are friends, and one of them is the leader. They don't elect him. They just recognize him for certain qualities. This is how it is and how it will be in the future. And here a bit of Khrushchevian racism for you, just a second. People won't all be black or red haired. There will be different colors and different temperaments and different mental capabilities among people. There will be inequality like elsewhere in nature. Okay, that's Khrushchev explaining the Sino-Soviet split. You get it, right? I mean, the Soviet Union was, how can China even pretend? We're so good, we're so important, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so that is kind of interesting because obviously that shows you the kind of mental framework here for understanding what's going on. So all of that obviously leads up, Khrushchev was overthrown in 1964, but then things did not really improve under Brezhnev. That leads us up to all the way to 1969 and the Sino-Soviet confrontation at the border, which brings us to the second most important turning point. The Sino-American rapprochement that changed international politics. Nixon and Kissinger obviously were willing and capable of taking advantage of the situation. By the way, when today people talk about playing China against Russia, they sometimes ignore this aspect. The Sino-Soviet alliance was already gone, and in fact, they hated each other. In fact, the Soviets were actually discussing a nuclear strike against China. That's how bad it was, right? So it wasn't amazing in any kind of sense that Kissinger recognized, or Nixon recognized, the fact that they could play China against Russia, which they, of course, did with first Kissinger's secret visit in 1971, followed by Richard Nixon's very public and earth-shattering visit in February 1972. And then you have a decade of the Sino-American rapprochement, which is extremely interesting to explore because at that time, the Sino-Soviet alliance was really frozen, wasn't going anywhere. Mao was really stubborn about the Soviet Union, saw the Soviets for a big threat, didn't want to improve relations. But in terms of America, of course, he was willing to engage. He was willing to almost conclude a quasi-alliance with the United States. And this was welcomed by the Americans, not only during the Nixon and Ford administration, but also during the Carter administration. Of course, it was on Carter's watch that's Big Brzezinski, National Security Advisor, traveled to Beijing in order to negotiate the conditions for normalization of the Sino-American relationship. The idea that was current in Washington at that time was that China would side with the United States because the United States was just more attractive, and that eventually the Chinese would come around to recognize that democracy is their future. Anyways, once they reformed a little bit, reform would lead to democracy, and basically things will turn out okay. Brzezinski was a fan of this idea. He had many detractors in the Carter administration, but he brushed them aside for their inability to understand his strategic genius. One example of this was the very bizarre conversation in the Oval Office that happened on June 4th, 1980, between then U.S. ambassador in Moscow, a guy named Thomas J. Watson, and Jimmy Carter. So the U.S. ambassador in Moscow was talking to Jimmy Carter about the relationship with the Soviet Union. And Watson, who privately worried about Carter's policy, attempted to convince the president that it was best for the U.S. to steer a neutral course between China and the USSR. And here's what he said. He said, I think we should keep in mind the basic nature of the Chinese and what they believe in, i.e. they're communists, etc. By not leaning overly in China's direction, the United States would not antagonize the Soviets, who the ambassador felt had a quote-unquote paranoid fear of China. Moreover, the Chinese, Watson continued, and I quote here, have a tendency to jump around from bed to bed. And I think we ought to make sure that they're lashed down to our bed before we undertake actions which we might regret later on. End of quote. I mean, this is for students of gender in IR. This is, you know, the words used here are way over the top. Anyway, so Brzezinski walked in on this conversation, and he said at this point, you have to remember, and that's a quote from Brzezinski, you have to remember that we are very sexy people. So in other words, the Chinese will never leave us for the Soviets because we're so sexy and they want to stay with us. Now, the Soviet take on all of that was, of course, a part of the Soviet leadership were really worried about all of this. You know, they saw this quasi-alliance, they saw it as detrimental to Soviet strategic interests, and they complained and complained and complained, mainly to the Americans and to the West Europeans, not so much to the Chinese, whom they really mistrusted, and there was really no relationship to speak of. But their worries were compensated by a kind of realization, certainly among these China experts in the foreign ministry, that the love affair between China and the United States was going to crash one day or another. Here we have, for example, Mikhail Kapitsa, who was one of the leading kind of a China gurus at the foreign ministry. Here's what he said, and I quote, China has nothing to lose from anti-Soviet views. And that's he explained that in 1982. They pay with these views for Western capital. His idea was China needed modernization, therefore they were anti-Soviet in order to kind of impress the United States, and the United States would give them the technologies that they needed, etc. But the good news, Kapitsa said, was that the Chinese, and I quote here, never befriend anyone for long. And then the Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko said this in 1979. You, i.e. the West, he said that, I can't remember to who, I think to Belgian Foreign Minister, somebody like that. You, the West, may be in a euphoric mood about China, he said, but the time will come when you will be shedding tears. So the Soviets were kind of, in a sense, they were not, they were worried about this, but on the other hand, they also thought, well, in time, we'll be able to fix this problem. And of course, eventually they did under Mikhail Gorbachev, who traveled to Beijing, notably in May 1989, in order to normalize the Sino-Soviet relationship. By the way, this became one of his probably the most lasting legacy of Gorbachev, the Sino-Russian rapprochement that happened in 1989, of course, then continued to develop in later years. So finally, the third moment of international politics that I wanted to discuss is the Sino-Russian strategic partnership. And here you basically know the story because it's in the news. We've followed this. We've followed how Sino-Russian relations have evolved since the Yeltsin times, but certainly under Putin, and especially in the last few years, in the last 10 years or so under Putin and Xi Jinping. Theirs is a very close relationship. They both claim it's the closest in history, and I think to an extent they're right, because even during the Sino-Soviet alliance, there were still kind of undercurrents of mistrust, and I think they have been able to develop a considerable sense of mutual confidence. And this kind of relationship, I would argue, and here you can basically, I can say that my general political orientation is that I'm quite anti-Putinist. Yeah, I'm quite liberal, anti-Putinist. I think what Putin is doing is crazy, etc. But at the same time, I think that a close relationship between Russia and China is actually in the interests of both countries. So even if Putin dropped dead today, and somebody else came into the office who was very liberal and wanted to embrace the West, I would think it a height of folly to neglect the relationship with Beijing, because for Russia, China is a major neighbor. You cannot escape this fact. And both states share a very difficult history, full of confrontation, full of blood, full of mistrust, and all kinds of horrid things. So therefore, they should treasure this relationship that has developed between them. There's obviously an economic underpinning here as well, and which is, can be seen even now in terms of Russia being able to count on China, at least for energy exports. It says, Russia is a reliable energy supplier, et cetera. Both countries see their interests broadly overlapping when it comes to joint opposition to what they term the American hegemony in the United Nations, for example, and other spheres. And of course, they also have overlapping strategic interests in Central Asia, even though there's also some kind of whiff of a competition there that has increasingly, it's been coming through with, although, of course, predictions that they would quarrel over Central Asia now date back to at least the early 2000s, and they haven't quite yet, but, it might happen. We don't know for sure. But anyway, there's some kind of cooperation still between them because they share strategic interests, whether it's political stability in this broad area or counterterrorism, and so on. Obviously not allowing any third powers to exploit their differences in order to get into this area. So there's a lot that they share, and this relationship is in mutual benefit. However, this is not to say that the relationship is going in the right direction today. So what has happened? Well, what happened is Vladimir Putin has committed a huge blunder by invading Ukraine and putting himself in direct opposition to the West, which markedly decreases his leverage vis-a-vis China, becomes a much weaker partner. He was already a junior partner, but he becomes much weaker. He sort of shuts off his options, really. He shuts off his ability to play China and the West against one another, which objectively could be in Russia's interest. In a sense, he's like in a role that Mao Zedong had in 1949, when, remember, I mentioned this whole thing where Mao, for ideological reasons, was so committed to the Sino-Soviet alliance that he rejected any sort of negotiations with the United States. Maybe those negotiations with the United States would have been actually useful for Mao. Who knows? Maybe it would have been better for Mao and for China to pursue a course of greater neutrality and non-alignment. But no, Mao Zedong, for reasons of ideological fixations, decided to clean the house before inviting guests. Well, Putin is cleaning the house of any kind of Western influences. Why? Why is he doing that? He's just weakening Russian bargaining power. We can see this already in terms of price negotiations with, for example, supplies of energy resources to the Chinese. We can probably will see that in the coming years in Central Asia and elsewhere in global theaters where Russia's and China's interests do not fully coincide. So, for example, whereas in the past, the Chinese were quite happy with the Russians kind of taking a neutral line or detached line whenever China had any kind of problems with the Indians or the Vietnamese, this is going to be increasingly more difficult because, of course, China is now dictating the terms, but it's still doing it very carefully. Xi Jinping is not Nikita Khrushchev. So whereas Nikita Khrushchev was willing to kind of just drive it and kind of force the Chinese to do what he wanted them to do, Xi Jinping has not so far at least showed much inclination for really exercising his tremendous leverage over Russia. But the question is, will he, or will somebody else who comes after him, will they do that? And that, of course, will put Russia in a very unfavorable strategic position. So that is, by the way, the point of the article that Dmitry Alperovich and I co-authored that was published just yesterday, I believe, by Foreign Affairs. And the argument there is that it's actually in Russia's own interest to not to do stupid things like what they have. It's obvious for many people. It's just obvious. And actually, I'm convinced that many people in the Russian political kind of analyst community, people in Moscow who deal with these issues, they understand this. I mean, okay, it's not rocket science. You don't want to become China's vassal. This is not good for you. You don't want to become the West's vassal, that's also fine. But the best position for a country like Russia, which is not really, doesn't have the capability of being the kind of superpower of the Soviet age, just can't do that, right? The best position is to leverage itself in a way that it can have influence both with China and in the West, and ideally be in a position to play one against the other. That is in Russia's interest. But unfortunately, this interest is not recognized by policymakers in the Kremlin, who are so attached to ideological quasi-imperialist notions. So I'll leave it at this. Thank you very much for listening, and let's open the floor to questions.